I have to ask you about why the Copenhagen interpretation, current understanding of quantum theory, gained so much in popularity. I think this could be a great case study in maybe sociology, psychology, how groupthink happens, how cults grow. Because I find it very ironic that science, which grew up on the virtue of empiricism and evidence and searching for the truth, often seems to fall into these pits of bias and stubbornness and lacking self-awareness to an extent that theories that it's supporting, they no longer make sense. They become quite incoherent, but still continues to support them. Why do you think the Copenhagen interpretation gained so much momentum and popularity when there were so many other alternatives out there as well?
Yeah, I don't know, really. I mean, there are various things that have been written about it. Um, and are you familiar with the quote from Feyerabend about this question?
I'm not.
He talks a little bit. He liked to be controversial, but he wasn't being, to me, terribly controversial here. He noticed that all kinds of weird ideas, like many worlds, but I'm not sure it was just coming on the scene, I believe, many worlds. I'm not sure he had it in mind. He said all kinds of weird ideas flourished, and Bohm's ideas were being ignored. He said he always find it, he said that he hopes that one fine day, historians and philosophers of science will take a close look at the matter. Basically, take a close look at the question you're asking, because it is very hard to understand this history. How did it happen like this? How did people end up saying such really weird things when there was something so simple and obvious that could have been said? This is much harder. This question is much harder than understanding quantum mechanics itself. It's much harder than understanding Bohmian mechanics. And indeed, what I just told you before about Bohmian mechanics, about the equations being so obvious in everything, obvious ontology evolving the obvious way, the natural rational response to that statement is, oh, yeah, that's all fine and good. But if something so obvious were correct, all physicists would have latched onto it. The fact that they haven't proved that theory, that obvious theory you're talking about, can't possibly be right. It makes wrong predictions. That's why nobody talks about it, because it clearly makes wrong predictions. That would be the rational thing to conclude. As it just turns out that all the theories, everything said in textbook quantum theory, except for the bad philosophy, is a theorem of Bohmian mechanics. It does not make those wrong predictions. And that's what's hard to understand. So then why did people not accept the obvious? Well, they really weren't focusing on the obvious for the first 20, 30 years. De Broglie was shot down. Rome came around, but at that day, Copenhagen was in its heyday, and anybody questioning Copenhagen could have their career truncated, as they tried to do to Bohm. It was really difficult. Bohm had a very tough time accepting and adjusting to how his theory was received. He had huge ambitions about what effect his theory would have. He thought that his theory would make the world safe for communism. Grand political effects. Of course, that seems a bit ridiculous. But he certainly didn't expect it to be utterly misunderstood and rejected. Anyway, that's what happened. Now, and I must say, when I first learned about the theory, I utterly dismissed it because I didn't understand it. And all my teachers had told me that something like that was impossible. And there were the no hidden variable theorems saying it was impossible. And I was inclined to accept all that as a student. It was only a bit later that I realized that was all bunk. Everything I'd been told was wrong. But there's a tendency to believe your teachers, and there's a tendency to believe authorities. That's one point. Second point, Bohr and Heisenberg were much better at public relations than Einstein and Schrodinger, who were critics of Copenhagen interpretation. Einstein and Schrodinger were really concerned about the truth, but they were not concerned with propagating the truth. They were concerned with finding it out. Bohr was concerned with he thought he had the truth, I suppose, and he was concerned not with a deeper understanding. I guess he thought he had the deepest understanding. He was concerned with winning the public relations war. So the Copenhagen School made a big effort in that direction, and they totally won. There's probably more could be said about that. The early years of the Copenhagen interpretation, the first several decades of the Copenhagen interpretation, until fairly recently, perhaps, were the heyday of logical positivism. First in philosophy, and then after logical positivism was abandoned in philosophy, it was still taken seriously, very seriously, by physicists. It was part of their physics upbringing. Only thing that is meaningful is what you can measure. How you measure a quantity defines what it means. All kinds of positivistic statements, which philosophers don't take seriously anymore, and physicists less so because of string theory. But that was part of what people were spoon-fed in order to get them to accept quantum mechanics. Don't ask these questions because they're meaningless questions, because there's no way you can determine the answer. So they're meaningless. They have no meaning. Forget it. Nonsense, not science. And once you've imbibed that, the more poorly you understand it, the more likely you are to resist abandoning it. And so that was also a contributing factor, I believe.
I do think it would be such a fascinating case study to study how the Copenhagen interpretation gained so much momentum, because we're talking about a theory that has such open questions, so many holes in it. And we're not just talking about, we're talking about some of the greatest minds who were convinced that this is the way forward. And then they imbibed the shut up and calculate phenomenon as well. It's incredible. Like, just on paper, it seems incredulous that this would happen in science, a subject that leads by empiricism, but it did happen. I would love to know like the root causes of it.
So would I. Again, as I said, it's not just that the scientific physics community was more or less almost to a man, but not quite. Einstein and Schrodinger were definitely exceptions, demanding adherence to all of these strange views. But on top of that, there was just sort of an obvious thing to say, which got rid of all the difficulties and all the strange views, the need for all those strange views. Just say particles means particles. So that means that however astonishing it was, it's astonishing squared in view of the obviousness of Bohmian mechanics.